The wagon stopped where the road gave up. Hadley Crane stood at the edge of the trail holding a suitcase that weighed almost nothing, because almost nothing was all she owned. Below her, the wagon driver was already turning his horses around, muttering about the grade being too steep, the trail too narrow, and how he wasn't paid enough to get himself killed hauling some fool bride up a mountain in Montana territory. She did not argue with him. She had learned in her 22 years of living that arguing with men who had already decided to leave was a waste of the only currency she could not afford to spend time. So she watched him go. The wagon rattled back down the valley road, growing smaller and smaller until it vanished around a bend of ponderosa pines, and then there was nothing but the sound of wind through the high grass and the distant clean silence of mountains that had never heard a woman's voice. Hadley looked up. The trail climbed steeply through a meadow of brown autumn grass, switchbacking twice before reaching a ridge where a cabin sat against the tree line like something the mountain had grown on its own. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. A corral sprawled to the west, dark shapes of cattle moving slowly inside. Beyond the cabin, the peaks of the Absaroka Range cut the sky into jagged pieces already dusted with the first snow of the season. It looked from this distance like the kind of place a person could belong to. Hadley picked up her suitcase and started climbing. She was halfway up the second switchback when she heard the shouting. Not screaming, not the sharp panic sound of someone in danger. This was louder than that, rougher, the kind of noise made by large animals in a confined space disagreeing about something fundamental. There was a crash. Something heavy hit a wall. A dog barked, not in alarm, but in what sounded remarkably like enthusiasm. Hadley walked faster. Walked. She reached the cabin porch, breathing hard from the climb, and found the front door standing wide open. She stepped into the doorway and stopped. The dining table had been flipped onto its side. A chair lay in three separate pieces on the floor. A cast iron pot had rolled into the corner, trailing a river of stew across the rough plank boards. And in the middle of this wreckage, four men were fighting. They were enormous, every single one of them. The smallest was still a full head taller than Hadley, and the largest looked like he had been assembled from the same materials as the cabin itself, timber and stone, and something too stubborn to bend. They were dirty. They were bearded except for the biggest one, whose beard was trimmed short and neat in a way that seemed almost defiant, surrounded by all that chaos. And they were locked together in a tangle of grab collars, pulled hair, and the kind of wrestling that only happens between people who have been fighting each other their entire lives and know exactly how far they can go before real damage is done. The biggest one, the one with the trim beard and blood running from his nose, had the smallest one's head locked under his arm. The smallest one was kicking at the legs of the second biggest, who had climbed onto a chair and was holding a book above his head with both hands, shouting at everyone to keep their hands off his property. The third one, dark-haired and quiet-faced, was simply trying to set the overturned table back on its legs, working around the chaos with the patience of a man who had done this many times before. In the corner, a large dog with golden brown fur and one ear that flopped sideways sat watching the entire scene, with his tail wagging steadily, as if this were a show put on specifically for his entertainment. Hadley stood in the doorway. She did not gasp. She did not retreat. She tilted her head slightly to the right, which was something she did when she was calculating, and she waited. The big one looked up first. His eyes found her across the room, and something in his face shifted. Not embarrassment exactly, more like the expression of a man who has been caught doing something he knows he should have stopped doing a long time ago. He released the smallest one's head, wiped the blood from his nose with the back of his sleeve, straightened up to his full height, which was considerable. "Sorry, ma'am," he said. His voice was deep and had the slightly flattened quality of a man who did not use it often enough to keep it polished. "We were just voting on who sleeps in the barn tonight." The room went quiet. The other three had noticed her now. The one on the chair slowly lowered his book. The small one sat up on the floor, hair pointing in four directions. The dark-haired one stopped adjusting the table and simply looked at her with an expression that gave away nothing at all. Hadley let the silence hold for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said, "Voting with fists." The small one on the floor grinned. It was a crooked grin, one side of his mouth higher than the other, the kind of smile that suggested he knew something you did not. A small scar marked his forehead like a white comma. "Family tradition," he said. The dog crossed the room in 3 bounds and pushed his nose into Hadley's hand, licking her fingers with urgent devotion. His tail hit the door frame in a steady, joyful rhythm. Hadley looked at the dew, looked at the 4 men, looked at the stew on the floor, the broken chair, the pile of dirty clothes in the corner that had achieved a height and density, suggesting it had been accumulating since the previous administration. The smell in the cabin was something she chose not to examine too closely. She set her suitcase down. "All of you," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Sit down." 4 men sat down. Not one of them could have explained why. The big one's name was Marshall Ledyard, and he was 35 years old, and he was the reason the other 3 were still alive, still together, and still living on this mountain. This was not opinion. This was fact confirmed by the way the other 3 looked at him when a decision needed making, the way they argued with him constantly, but obeyed him eventually, and the way his hands bore the calluses of a man who had been holding too many reins for too many years. He read the advertisement that Hadley placed on the table. Read it again. Then turned to the smallest brother with an expression that could have frozen the stew that was already cooling on the floor. "Sullivan." The small one, who was apparently named Sullivan but whom everyone called Sully, had the good sense to stand up straight. "Yes? Did you place a marriage advertisement in a newspaper?" Sully brushed off his pants with exaggerated dignity. "Somebody had to marshal. Look at us. We share 6 shirts between 4 men. We eat with our hands because every fork we've ever owned is broken. The dog is the cleanest member of this family. We needed help. So you ordered a wife, like ordering seed corn from a catalog." The one with the book, whose name was Doyle, spoke from his chair. He was leaner than the others, lighter-haired, and had ink stains on his fingers that suggested a life lived at least partially inside his own head. "To be fair," he said, "he's not wrong about the shirts." The dark-haired one spoke. His name was Tiernan, and his voice had the quality of something rarely used and therefore still precise. "Or the hands," he said. 2 words, then silence. Marshall stared at Sully with the specific fury of an older brother who has spent his entire adult life making decisions for the family and has just discovered that the youngest made one without asking. This was not about Hadley, she realized. This was about control. Marshall decided things. That was the arrangement. That was the promise. Sully stared back, and in his eyes, Hadley could see something. She recognized the frustration of the youngest, the one who was never consulted, never taken seriously, whose opinions were heard and then overruled so consistently that he had stopped offering them through proper channels and started going around the system entirely. These 2 had been having this fight for years. She was simply the latest version of it. Hadley let them burn for exactly long enough, and then she spoke. "Mr. Ledyard," she addressed Marshall directly because she understood within 5 minutes of entering this cabin that he was the gate. Nothing came in or went out without his permission. "I traveled 11 days by train and 3 by wagon to reach this place. I have no home to return to. The woman who gave me shelter died, and her son put me out of the shop and the room behind it on the same afternoon. I have 40 cents in my pocket, 1 dress to my name, and a sewing kit. I am not asking for love. I am asking for a roof and honest work. In return, I can cook, I can sew, I can clean, and I can organize 4 grown men who apparently cannot locate a fork." The cabin was very quiet. Sully, who could not resist, said, "We had forks. They broke." Hadley did not look at him. "Then I will fix that too." Marshall studied her. Not her face, not her figure, but something behind her eyes, some quality he was trying to measure. Hadley held still and let him look. She had been looked at by men who were deciding her fate before, and she had learned that the worst thing you could do in that moment was flinch. Finally, Marshall spoke. He did not smile. He did not welcome her. He pointed toward the back of the cabin past the kitchen area to a door she had not noticed. "That door goes to the barn. There's a hay loft. Clean, dry, warm enough. You can sleep there tonight." Hadley waited. She sensed there was more. "Ma's room is behind the kitchen. It has a real door and a window, but that room is not for strangers." He paused. "If you're still here in a week and you still want to be, we'll talk." He pulled a pair of leather work gloves from his belt and set them on the table in front of her. "Your hands will blister without these, Mom." Then he walked out of the cabin and did not look back. The hayloft was exactly what Marshall had described: clean, dry, warm enough. Hadley stood in it as the last light of day came through the case in the barn wall and turned the hay to gold, and she thought about how many rooms she had been given in her life that were not quite rooms. The corner of Mrs. Fenn's shop where she slept on a cot behind the fabric bolts. The poorhouse ward in Burlington where she had spent one night before deciding she would rather die on a mountaintop than live in that place. And now this, a barn loft on a Montana mountain offered by a man who did not trust her enough for a real room, but was honest enough to say so. She could work with honest. She unpacked her suitcase. There was not much to unpack. One change of underclothes, her sewing kit wrapped in oiled cloth, thread in 6 colors, needles in 4 sizes, a pair of scissors that had been her mother's, though she had never known her mother except through these scissors and the things Mrs. Fenn had told her. And at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of canvas so old it was nearly soft, her father's rifle. A Springfield cut down to a shorter stock because Otis Crane had been a practical man who believed his daughter should be able to shoot what she could carry. She had been 8 years old when he first put it in her hands, and the rifle had been longer than she was tall, and he had laughed at the way she staggered under its weight and then shown her how to brace it against a fence post until her arms grew strong enough. Hadley unwrapped the rifle, checked the action. It was clean and oiled because she maintained it the way her father had taught her, which was the way you maintained anything that might one day stand between you and something that wanted to kill you religiously. She wrapped it back up and slid it under the hay where she would sleep. No one needed to know about this. Not yet. Maybe not ever. In Vermont, a woman who could shoot was called wild, unladylike, dangerous, and Hadley had lost enough already. She was not going to lose her chance at a roof by giving these men a reason to be afraid of her. She lay down on the hay. Bishop the dog appeared from somewhere, climbed the ladder with the ease of long practice, and lay down directly across the loft entrance like a living barricade. He looked at her once, set his chin on his paws, and closed his eyes. No one had told him to do this. Hadley looked at the wing for a long time. Then she closed her own eyes and slept. She woke before dawn, which was a habit so deeply embedded in her body that she was not sure she could break it, even if she wanted to. The loft was cold. Bishop was still at the entrance, but his ears were up, and when Hadley climbed down the ladder, she saw why. Someone had been here in the night. The barn floor in front of her sleeping area had been swept clean. A thick wool blanket folded neatly sat on a hay bale. Beside it, a bucket of fresh water with a clean cloth draped over the rim. And in the corner, a stack of fresh hay had been laid down in a pattern that was not random, not just thrown, but deliberately arranged into something that resembled, if you tilted your head and were generous, a mattress. Hadley looked at this for a long time. When she walked outside into the gray pre-dawn light, she saw Tiernan crossing from the cabin to the woodpile. He did not look at her. He did not speak. But on the sleeve of his dark shirt, caught in the fabric near his wrist, were 3 pieces of hay. He picked up his axe and began to chop. The first week was a war fought entirely with soap thread and patience. Hadley started with the laundry because the laundry was the most immediate crisis. She heated water in the large pot, not the cast iron one that sat on the stove, like a sacred object she had already learned not to touch. And she told the 4 Ledyard brothers to bring her every piece of clothing they owned. Sully brought 3 shirts and held up the one he was wearing. "I've had this one on for 3 weeks straight. It knows my shape by now." "The dog knows your shape too," Hadley said. "That does not mean he enjoys it." Doyle laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it came out rusty like a gate that had not been opened in a long time. Tiernan's mouth twitched, which she was beginning to understand was his version of a standing ovation. Marshall brought his clothes in silence, set them in the pile, and walked away. He had not spoken more than 10 words to her since the first night, and each of those words had been functional. He was watching her the way a man watches a river that might flood, with respect, with caution, and with the knowledge that he could not actually stop it if it decided to come. She washed the clothes. She mended what could be mended, which was almost everything, because Hadley Crane could sew the way some people could breathe, without thinking, without effort, with a precision that turned rags into garments, and garments into something a person could wear without shame. She taught Marshall to make a basic stew, standing beside him at the stove, while he cut onions with the intensity of a man splitting logs. The pieces were enormous. Each chunk of onion could have served as a meal on its own. "Smaller," she said. "It's an onion, not firewood." He looked at her. For 1/2 of 1 second, something shifted behind his eyes. Not quite a smile. The ghost of one. The possibility of one. Then it was gone and he went back to cutting and the pieces were marginally smaller. She stitched curtains for the windows from old burlap sacks. They were rough and plain and would not have passed inspection in any home east of the Mississippi. But when she hung them, the cabin changed. Not dramatically. Not the way paint changes a room or furniture changes a space. It changed the way a name changes a stranger. Suddenly, it was no longer anonymous. It was specific. It was someone's. Tiernan stood looking at the curtains for a very long time that evening. He did not speak. He just looked, and in his dark eyes there was something Hadley could not quite name. Hunger, maybe, or recognition. Doyle, who noticed everything and wrote it all down in the leather journal he carried, like other men carried weapons, sat at the table that night and wrote, September 14th, curtains. The cabin looks like a home. On the third day, Hadley made a mistake. She was reorganizing the kitchen. Not dramatically, just moving the smaller pots to a lower shelf where she could reach them, shifting the tin plates to a spot nearer the table, creating the kind of quiet order that makes a kitchen function instead of merely exist. She reached for the cast iron pot on the stove, the big one, the one that sat in the exact center of the cooking surface, as if it had been placed there by divine authority. She picked it up. She moved it 6 inches to the left. Don't! Marshall's voice came from behind her, and it was not the low, controlled voice she had been hearing all week. It was something harder. Something that had edges. She turned. He stood in the kitchen doorway and his face had changed. The careful neutrality was gone. In its place was something raw, something that looked like anger but was shaped like pain. Don't move that. Hadley held the pot. It's just a pot. I was making room for Ma, put it there. His voice cracked on the word ma, just barely, just enough for someone who was listening as carefully as Hadley always listened. She put everything where it is. Every pot, every plate, every spoon. Don't move it. The cabin went silent. From the main room, Hadley could feel the other three brothers watching, not intervening. They knew this terrain. They had walked around it for 5 years, careful as men walking around an unexploded shell, knowing it was there, knowing it was dangerous, but having no idea how to make it safe. Hadley understood then. The cabin was not messy because 4 men were lazy. The cabin was messy because it had been frozen. Marshall had kept everything exactly where Colleen Ledyard had left it on the day she died, because to move anything, to change anything, to clean or organize or improve anything was to admit that she was not coming back to put it right herself. The disorder was not neglect. It was a monument. Hadley set the pot back, exactly where it had been. She made sure the bottom ring aligned with the faint mark on the stove surface where it had sat for years. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't know. Marshall looked at the peat, then at her, then at the pot again. Now you do, he said, and walked out. That night, Hadley sat in the hayloft and made a decision. She would not remove anything from this cabin. She would not rearrange Colleen's kitchen. She would not try to replace what was there. She would add curtains on bare windows, thread on torn shirts, forks carved from wood since the metal ones were broken, new things beside old things, not instead of, beside. She could work with that. On the 5th morning, Hadley noticed the tear in Marshall's shirt. It was on the right shoulder, a clean rip along the seam, where the fabric had simply given up after too many years of being stretched across shoulders that were built for harder work than any shirt could handle. He had been wearing it torn for what looked like days, maybe weeks. That night, after the brothers had gone to bed, Hadley sat by the fire and mended it. She worked the way she always worked, quietly, precisely, with stitches so small and even that they became nearly invisible against the fabric. It took her 20 minutes. When she was finished, the mend was there if you looked for it, but you would have to look hard. She hung the shirt on the back of Marshall's chair. He wore it the next morning without comment. But 3 times during the day, Hadley saw his left hand rise to his right shoulder and touch the mended seam. He did it the way a person touches a bruise unconsciously, repeatedly, drawn to it by something deeper than thought. His fingers found the neat line of stitches and traced them, and his face did something complicated that he shut down before it could fully form. 2 mornings later, Hadley came around the back of the cabin at dawn and found Marshall standing alone, his back to her, his left hand on his right shoulder, fingers resting on the men. He was very still. The mountains were pink with first light behind him, and the steam from his breath rose in slow clouds. He did not turn around, but he knew she was there. She could tell by the way his shoulders tightened, just slightly, the way a man tightens when he is about to say something that costs him. "My mother was the last person who mended my clothes," he said, 5 years ago. Hadley stood still. She did not step closer. She did not reach for him. She understood that what was happening in this moment was as delicate as surgery, and that any wrong movement would close him up again, possibly forever. "I don't need you to thank me," she said. "I need you to stop wearing torn shirts." He turned then, and for 1 second, one single unguarded second, Marshall Ledyard smiled. It was not a big smile. It broke across his stone face like a crack in a dam, brief and startling and gone almost before it arrived. But it was real. Hadley saw it. And she knew in the way that people who have spent their lives reading faces know things that this was the first real smile this man had allowed himself in a very long time. Then it was gone and he was Marshall again, and he walked toward the cattle pen with his usual heavy stride. But there was something different in the way he moved that morning, something fractionally lighter, as if one of the things he had been carrying had been set down just for a moment, just long enough to remember what it felt like to have both hands free. That evening, Marshall came to the hayloft. He did not enter. He stood at the bottom of the ladder and placed a wooden key on the lowest rung. "Room behind the kitchen," he said, "is small, but it has a door. We don't go in there." Hadley looked at the key, looked at him. He was already walking away. She picked up the key and held it in her palm. It was hand-carved, worn smooth by years of use. Colleen's key, Colleen's room. And now it was being given to her not by a man who trusted easily, but by a man who trusted almost never, and had decided after 7 days of watching her add without taking away that she had earned the right to step inside the space his mother had left behind. She moved into the room that night. It was small as promised. A narrow bed with a corn husk mattress, a window with no curtain, a shelf with a comb, a hand mirror, and a dried wildflower in a tin cup. Colleen's things. Hadley did not move them. She placed her own suitcase in the corner, her sewing kit on the bed, and the rifle still wrapped in canvas under the mattress. Bishop followed her and turned 3 circles on the floor beside the bed and lay down with a sigh of completion. He had been waiting for this, his expression seemed to say. He had known it would happen. He had simply been patient. By the second week, Hadley had mapped the brothers. Marshall was the wall. Everything in this family hit Marshall first and either bounced off or was absorbed. He made decisions. He enforced order. He stood between his brothers and the world with the implacability of geography. When there was danger, Marshall moved toward it. When there was food, Marshall ate last. When there was work, Marshall did the hardest part. This was not generosity. This was compulsion. He had promised his dying mother that he would keep them together, and he had interpreted that promise in the most literal and exhausting way possible by making himself responsible for everything, always forever, with no relief and no help and no acknowledgement that he was drowning. Doyle was the watcher. He saw what the others missed because he was always looking. His journal was not a hobby. It was a record of a mind that could not stop cataloging the world. He wrote down the weather, the cattle count, which days the columbines bloomed, how many times Sully threw his knife in an evening, and the precise angle of sunlight that hit the kitchen window at 4 in the afternoon. He was teased constantly, but Doyle was not dreaming. He was documenting. And there was a difference. Sully was the mouth. He said what no one else would say, and he said it fast and sharp and with a grin that dared you to be offended. He was the youngest by a wide margin and had spent his entire life being overruled by Marshall, underestimated by everyone, and quietly furious about both. His knife, a small folding blade that he tossed and caught in a constant unconscious rhythm, was his heartbeat made visible. When the knife went up slowly and came down softly, Sully was at peace. When it went up high and came down hard, something was wrong. Hadley learned to read the knife the way sailors read the wind, as early warning. And then there was Tiernan. Tiernan was the one Hadley could not map. He worked harder than all of them. He woke before everyone slept after everyone, and filled the hours between with a quantity of labor that seemed almost punitive. He fixed fences, chopped wood, dug post holes, hauled water, moved cattle, and repaired every broken thing on the property with the silent efficiency of a man who believed that if he ever stopped moving, something terrible would happen. But that was not the part that troubled Hadley. Plenty of men worked hard. What troubled her was the way Tiernan existed inside the family. Marshall Doyle and Sully fought constantly. They argued about food, about chores, about whose turn it was to muck out the barn. They threw boots at each other across the cabin. They stole portions from each other's plates and told elaborate lies about it. They were loud and rude and completely without ceremony, the way only blood brothers can be, the way people are when they know deep in the architecture of their bones that the pinning cannot be broken no matter how hard they pull. Tiernan never fought. He never argued with Marshall, never teased Sully, never complained about a chore or a decision or a slight. He agreed with everything, did everything, questioned nothing. He moved through the family like a guest who had overstayed his welcome and knew it and was trying to make up for it by being so useful that no one could justify asking him to leave. Hadley tilted her head to the right and watched. She noticed other things, small things. Tiernan's hair was black where his brother's hair was brown. His eyes were dark, nearly black, where theirs were lighter. His jaw was more angular, his cheekbones sharper, his build more compact. These differences were subtle, easy to miss, easy to explain away as the normal variation that occurs in any family. But Hadley Crane had spent her life reading faces and measuring silences, because when you are an orphan and your survival depends on understanding the people who hold power over you, you learn to see what others overlook. Tiernan Ledyard did not behave like a brother. He behaved like a man who was afraid. She did not ask, not yet. She filed it away in the place where she kept the things she knew but could not yet prove, and she waited. One night late in the second week, Hadley could not sleep. She walked out onto the cabin porch and found Doyle sitting with his journal open on his knee, writing by the light of a quarter moon. "What do you write about?" she asked. He looked up startled, then relaxed. And of all the brothers, Doyle was the one most comfortable with her presence because Hadley was the first person in 5 years who had asked him a question and genuinely wanted to hear the answer. Everything he said, weather, cattle count, when the columbines bloom, the color of the sky at different hours. Flowers, he almost smiled. I write about all of them too, my brothers. Hadley sat on the porch step. What do you write about, Sully? Doyle flipped back through the pages, found what he was looking for, read aloud in his quiet, precise voice. October 2nd. Sullivan threw his knife at a tree stump 47 times, missed twice, smiled once when he thought nobody was watching. Hadley looked at him. You counted? I always count. A sound from inside the cabin. Sully, who was apparently not asleep, who had apparently been listening from his bed near the window, spoke from the darkness. Don't stop writing, Doyle. Doyle closed the journal, tapped his fingers on the spine, a nervous habit that Hadley noticed accelerated when emotions were running high. Tonight the tapping was slow, steady, something like contentment. Then he opened the journal again and told her the thing he had been wanting to tell someone for weeks. I've been noting something strange, he said. This time of year, wolves stay high, above the tree line. They follow the elk herds up, and they don't come down until deep winter drives the game lower. But for the last 2 weeks, I've been finding tracks around the western meadow, right where our cattle graze. He showed her the journal entries, dates, locations, track counts, little sketches of paw prints with measurements noted beside them. And the tracks are increasing. 3 sets on September 28th, 5 on October 1st, 7 on October 5th, all converging on the same area. Wolves migrating. Doyle shook his head. Wolves don't migrate in this pattern. A pack moves together following prey. These tracks suggest multiple animals being drawn to a single location from different directions, as if something is pulling them in. He closed the journal and looked at her with the expression of a man who has been shouting into a well and hearing only his own echo. I told Marshall. He said I think too much. Hadley held his gaze, nodded once. It was a small thing, a nod. But Doyle's finger stopped tapping and he sat up a little straighter, and in his green eyes Hadley could see something kindle that looked very much like the relief of a man who has finally been believed. The wolves came 3 nights later. It was after midnight. Hadley woke to the sound of cattle screaming, a raw animal terror that ripped through the quiet of the mountain night like a blade through cloth. She was out of bed before the scream finished. Through the cabin window, she could see shapes moving in the corral low and fast, and the cattle were surging against the fence rails in a panicked mass. The four brothers were already moving. Marshall grabbed his rifle from the rack above the door. Sully had his knife and a shotgun. Doyle grabbed a torch from the fireplace. Tiernan simply ran empty-handed toward the corral because Tiernan's first instinct was always to put his body between the threat and the things he was trying to protect. 3 wolves circled the herd. They moved with the coordinated precision of animals that had done this before, working the cattle's flanks, driving them toward the broken section of fence where the rails had been weakened by last winter's storms. The lead wolf was larger than the others, silver-gray in the moonlight, moving with a confidence that bordered on authority. Marshall fired a warning shot. The wolves scattered into the darkness. But 2 cattle had been bitten deep gashes on their hindquarters that would take weeks to heal, weeks they did not have, because the livestock auction in Miles City opened in 5 weeks, and the mountain passes would close with the first heavy snow. 30 cattle had become 28 that could walk to market. At dawn, Doyle went to the western meadow and found what he had expected to find. Wolf tracks, 7 sets converging from 3 directions. And beside them, half obscured by the morning frost but unmistakable to anyone who was looking, the crescent-shaped print of a shod horse. He brought this information to Marshall. "Wolves don't ride horses," he said. Marshall looked at the tracks, looked at Doyle. "You think too much," he said again. But this time there was less certainty in his voice. And when he walked away, he walked in the direction of the gun rack, and he loaded the second rifle, the one that usually hung unused on the wall, and he set it where it could be reached quickly. Doyle looked at Hadley across the cabin. She nodded again. He opened his journal and wrote October 8th, hoof prints beside wolf tracks. Someone is bringing them here. 4 days later, a man rode up the mountain trail. He was tall and thin, and he sat his horse with the patience of someone who had been watching this ranch for a long time before deciding to introduce himself. His face was long, narrow, with cheekbones that threw sharp shadows and eyes that were pale gray, nearly silver, the color of ice that is almost ready to break. He wore a long leather coat that reached past his knees and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his expression. Everything about him was clean and deliberate, too polished for a man who claimed to make his living in the wilderness. Beside his horse on the ground stood an animal. Cormac Voss introduced it as a dog. A hybrid, he said, part shepherd, part something wild. He called it Ember. It had silver-gray fur, yellow eyes, and the watchful, coiled bearing of a creature that was not and had never been domesticated. Around its neck was a leather collar with a small chain link. Bishop took one look at Ember and growled. Not his playful growl, not the rumble he made when Sully teased him with food. This was a deep, sustained warning that started in his chest and did not stop. He backed up until he was pressed against Hadley's legs, and he stayed there, vibrating with a conviction that no amount of reassurance could shake. Voss removed his hat, smiled. It was a careful smile, the kind that had been practiced in mirrors until it looked natural. "I hear you neighbors had some wolf trouble," he said. His voice was soft and slow, and he pronounced every word as if he were doing you a favor by speaking at all. "I'm Cormac Voss. I specialize in wolf removal. The McBride Ranch up north hired me last month. Their wolf problem was cleared inside 2 weeks." Marshall stood on the porch with his arms crossed. "What is it, wifey?" $200. Voss paused. "Let the number settle. But if cash is tight, and I understand it often is for hard-working folks like yourselves, I accept land. 5 acres would do. That creek bottom on your west side, perhaps?" "We don't sell land." "Of course not." Voss's smile did not waver. "Just an offer, neighbor, but I should mention that wolves are patient creatures. They test a herd, come back bigger each time, and winter makes them bold." He let that sit. Then he looked around the ranch casually, the way a man looks at a property he is already measuring in his mind. His gaze moved from the cabin to the corral to the 4 brothers to Hadley standing on the porch steps. And then his eyes found Tiernan. He looked at Tiernan the way a person looks at a word they recognize in a foreign language. Not surprise exactly. Recognition. His pale eyes stayed on Tiernan's face for 3 seconds longer than they stayed on anyone else. And in those 3 seconds, something passed behind them that Hadley could not identify, but could feel the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Then Voss turned his horse, put his hat back on. Over his shoulder, almost as an afterthought, he said, "Fine ranch you have here. Your mother chose good land. She always did know how to pick things." He paused. The pause was deliberate. People especially. Then he rode down the trail and Ember followed, and Bishop did not stop growling until both of them had disappeared into the tree line. That night, Hadley lay in Colleen's room with Bishop pressed against the side of the bed and listened to the sounds of the ranch settling into darkness. Tiernan's axe outside, steady and rhythmic. The wind through the pines. An owl somewhere on the ridge. Three things were wrong. Wolves that arrived with hoofprints beside their tracks. A stranger who looked at Tiernan with the eyes of a man recognizing something he had been looking for. And a dog that had known before any human in this cabin had understood that the man on the horse was dangerous. She reached under the mattress and touched the canvas wrapping of her father's rifle. The steel was cold through the cloth. She did not know yet what was coming. But she knew it was coming, and she knew with the calm certainty of a woman who had been aiming at targets since she was 8 years old, that when it arrived she would not miss. The thing about Tiernan Ledyard that Hadley could not stop noticing was not what he did. It was when he did it. Every morning she woke to find something in the cabin that had been broken the night before now fixed. A table leg that had wobbled for weeks was suddenly steady. The rope on the well bucket, frayed to its last 3 strands, was replaced overnight with new cord braided so tightly it could have held a horse. A gap in the kitchen wall where wind came through, stuffed with clay and straw, and packed smooth, the repair so clean it looked like it had always been there. Tiernan never mentioned any of this. He did not point to the repairs. He did not wait for gratitude. He simply woke before everyone went to bed, after everyone, and filled the hours between with a ceaseless, almost frantic industry that turned the broken things whole and the rough things smooth. If you asked him about a repair, he would shrug. If you thanked him, he would look confused, as if the concept of being thanked for breathing was equally strange. Hadley understood this language. She spoke it herself. It was the language of people who believed they had to earn their place every single day, because the alternative, the terrifying alternative, was that someone would look at them and realize they did not belong and ask them to leave. She had sewn her way through 8 years of Mrs. Fenn's shop with that same desperate energy, stitch after stitch after stitch, as if the thread were the only thing keeping her tethered to a world that had no legal or biological obligation to keep her. Tiernan chopped wood the way Hadley sewed, not because it needed doing, but because stopping meant being visible. And being visible meant being judged, and being judged meant possibly being found wanting. One evening in the 3rd week, Hadley walked onto the porch and found Tiernan repairing the door hinge. It was nearly dark. He was working by feel, his large hands moving over the metal with a sensitivity that seemed impossible given their size. The hinge had been squeaking for days, and no one had asked him to fix it because no one ever had to ask Tiernan to fix anything. Hadley sat down on the porch step. She did not speak. She simply sat 3 feet from where he worked and let him know through her presence that someone saw him. That the invisible labor was not in fact invisible. That at least one person in this world was paying attention. Tiernan's hand stopped. "You don't have to sit here," he said. His voice was low, careful, the voice of a man who measures his words because he has so few of them. "I know," Hadley said, "but I want to." He looked at her then, just for a moment. In the fading light, his dark eyes held something she could not quite read, something between gratitude and terror, the expression of a man who has just been offered a gift he is not sure he is allowed to accept. Then he went back to the hinge, and Hadley stayed where she was, and neither of them said another word. But the silence between them was not empty. It was the kind of silence that holds things. Marshal Ledyard sat on a fence rail every evening and counted cattle. This was not a metaphor. He literally sat on the top rail of the corral fence in the last light of day and counted every animal in the herd. He had been doing this since he was 20 years old, since his father died and the ranch became his responsibility, and in 15 years he had never missed an evening count. It was the last thing he did before dark, and it was the thing that told him whether tomorrow would be survivable. 28, that was the number now. 30 at the start of autumn, -2 bitten in the first wolf attack, both healing but neither fit to walk the 60 miles to the Miles City auction. 28 cattle that could make the drive, and he needed 25 at minimum to pay the supply debt from last winter, and buy enough provisions to keep 4 men alive through the Montana cold. 5 weeks until the auction. 5 weeks until the passes closed with snow. 3 cattle was his margin. 3 animals between solvency and ruin. Hadley found him on the fence rail one morning earlier than usual, staring at the mountains with his left hand rubbing the callus on his palm. She had learned that this gesture, the rubbing of the callus, was Marshall's version of pacing. Other men wore tracks in their floors. Marshall wore tracks in his own skin. She stood near him, not too close. She had mapped his boundaries carefully over 3 weeks and knew exactly how much proximity he could tolerate before his walls went up. "How long have you been carrying everything alone?" she asked. He did not turn. "Since Ma died. Before that, since Pa died." "That's a long time to hold the reins." The callous rubbing stopped. He was quiet for so long that Hadley thought he might not answer. Then he said in a voice stripped of everything except the raw fact of it, "I promised her. Keep them together." That's all she asked. "She asked you to keep them together," Hadley said. "She didn't ask you to carry them." Marshall turned his head. Not his body, just his head. And he looked at her with an expression she had not seen before. Not the assessment, not the caution. Something else. Something that involves seeing her as a specific person rather than a category of problem. His eyes stayed on hers for a beat longer than was necessary. Then 2 beats. Then he turned away and climbed down from the fence and walked toward the cabin with his usual heavy stride. But Hadley noticed, because Hadley noticed everything, that his left hand hung at his side instead of rubbing the callus, and his shoulder sat a fraction of an inch lower than usual, as if something very small and very heavy had been for just one moment set down. The wolves came back on a Tuesday. They came in force, 7 animals this time, moving through the darkness with the coordinated silence of a military operation. They hit the corral from the east side where the fence was newest, and therefore where the brothers were least expecting an assault, and they hit it fast. Hadley woke to the sound of splintering wood and cattle screaming, and Marshall's voice cutting through the chaos like an axe through kindling, shouting his brothers' names in the order he always used: Tiernan, Doyle, Sully. Oldest responsibility to youngest. Always. She was out of bed and at the window in 3 seconds. Through the glass, she could see torchlight and running shapes in the low fluid movement of wolves working the edges of the herd. The cattle were panicking, slamming against the fence rails, and one section of the east fence was already down the rails, scattered like broken bones. The 4 brothers were in the corral. Marshall and Sully had rifles. Doyle held a torch in each hand, swinging them in wide arcs to create a wall of light. Tiernan was in the gap where the fence had broken, standing with his arms spread wide, using nothing but his body to block a 1,200-pound steer from bolting through the opening into the darkness where the wolves waited. Hadley saw all of this in the time it took to draw one breath. Then she saw the wolf. It was the big one, the leader, silver-gray, larger than the others by a significant margin, moving along the corral's south fence with a focus that was not random. It was not attacking the cattle, it was circling, working its way around the perimeter toward the broken section where Tiernan stood alone with his back to the darkness and his arms full of terrified steer. The wolf was hunting Tiernan, not the cattle, the man. Hadley did not go to the bedroom for her father's rifle. There was no time. She crossed the cabin in 4 strides, pulled Marshall's hunting rifle from the rack above the door, checked the chamber by feel in the darkness, and raised it to her shoulder and stepped onto the porch. The wolf was 40 yards away. It was dark. The only light came from Doyle's torches, which threw dancing shadows that made every shape uncertain. Tiernan had his back turned. The wolf was 3 seconds from his unprotected flank. Hadley breathed in, held it, found the silver shape in the rifle's sights, adjusted for the torchlight flutter. Squeezed. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, and the sound of it split the night open. The silver wolf staggered. The bullet took it in the left shoulder, exactly where Hadley had aimed, high enough to wound, but not to kill. The animal went down, scrambled, and then dragged itself into the darkness with a speed that spoke of something other than a wild creature's panic. It moved like something that had somewhere specific to go, something that was expected. The other wolves scattered. Within 30 seconds, the corral was clear. In the ringing silence that followed the gunshot, 4 men turned toward the cabin. Hadley stood on the porch with the rifle still at her shoulder, the muzzle still trailing a thin ghost of smoke. Her right eye was closed in the marksman's squint her father had taught her when she was 8 years old, and her body was set in the shooter's stance that 20 years of practice had made as natural as standing. She was calm, her hands were steady, her breathing was even. Sully spoke first because Sully always spoke first. His voice was high and incredulous and carried the particular amazement of a man who has just been forced to completely revise his understanding of reality. "You shot that thing from over there." Hadley lowered the rifle. It was about to take Tiernan's throat. I didn't have many choices. Marshall was looking at her, not at the rifle, not at the porch, at her. His face held an expression she had not seen from him before, not surprise, not anger, not even admiration. Recalculation. She could see him rebuilding his understanding of who she was from the ground up, tearing down the framework of mail-order bride and seamstress and woman who needs protecting, and replacing it piece by piece with something that had no convenient name. Marshall's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. The advertisement said seamstress. "I am a seamstress," Hadley said. "My father was a hunter. He taught me to sew with my mother's needles and shoot with his rifle. I've been doing both since before I was tall enough to reach a kitchen shelf." "Why didn't you tell us?" She set the rifle down on the porch rail. "Carefully, the way you set down something that has just saved a life and might need to do it again. Because where I come from, a woman who can shoot gets called things that close doors. I've already had enough doors closed. I wasn't going to give you a reason to close this one." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of understanding. Marshall knew about hiding. Tiernan knew about hiding. Every person in this family carried something they kept behind a locked door because showing it might cost them the only home they had. Marshall nodded once, slow, and in that nod was something larger than permission. It was acknowledgement. In the morning they counted the cattle. 3 more had been injured. Deep bites. They would heal, but not in time for the drive. 25 fit for market, the exact minimum. 1 more attack and they were finished. Hadley followed the blood trail at dawn. She went alone with Marshall's rifle on her shoulder and her father's lessons in her head. The trail was easy to follow. The silver wolf had bled steadily dark drops on the frost-covered grass that led east from the corral toward the tree line. She tracked it for 200 yards, moving slowly, reading the ground the way her father had taught her to read it, not just the blood, but the depth of the prints, the distance between them, the way they shortened and dragged as the animal weakened. At 200 yards, the blood trail stopped. Not because the wolf had died, because the wolf had been collected. The blood drops ended at a patch of churned earth where something large had stood. A horse. The hoof prints were deep and fresh, pressed into the cold ground within the last 6 hours. Beside the hoof prints in the mud where the horse had shifted its weight were the marks of a man's boots. Someone had dismounted, lifted the wounded wolf onto the horse and ridden away. And on the ground, half buried in the mud beside the hoof prints, Hadley found a small piece of chain. 3 links rusted at the edges, broken from something larger. She picked it up and turned it over in her fingers and recognized the metalwork immediately because she was a seamstress who worked with materials every day and could identify a buckle or a clasp or a chain link the way a musician could identify a note. It was the same chain that formed part of the collar around the neck of the animal Cormac Voss called his dog. Hadley stood in the cold morning air with the chain links in her palm and understood. The silver wolf was Ember, Voss's animal, the one he claimed was a hybrid, part dog, part wild, harmless, tame. Ember led the wild pack, drew them to the ranch, guided them to the cattle, directed the attacks. And when Ember was wounded, Voss came in the darkness and carried his weapon home. The wolves were not wild. They were aimed. She walked back to the cabin and placed the chain links on the table in front of the 4 brothers. "Your wolves aren't wild," she said. "They're being led by the animal Voss calls a dog. This chain is from its collar. I found it beside hoof prints at the end of the blood trail. Someone rode in last night and carried the wounded wolf away." Doyle's face lit with the fierce, vindicated brightness of a man who has been shouting the truth into empty rooms for weeks. "Hoof prints next to wolf tracks. I told you, bow." Marshall picked up the chain links, held them close, looked at Hadley with an expression that was equal parts respect and something deeper. Something that might have been in a man less fortified against his own emotions, admiration. "You shot a wolf in the dark." Now you're tracking evidence like a frontier scout. He paused. Are you really a seamstress? I am a seamstress, Hadley said for the second time, without impatience, without heat, with only the steady clarity of someone who had spent her life being underestimated and had learned to treat it not as an insult, but as an advantage. My father was a hunter. He taught me both. Voss returned on a Thursday. This time Ember was not with him. He rode up the trail alone, dismounted with the unhurried ease of a man who owned more time than anyone around him, and approached the cabin porch where Marshall stood, with his arms crossed and the rifle leaning against the rail within reach. Voss kept his voice soft. He always kept his voice soft. It was one of his best tools, that softness, because it forced you to lean in, to listen carefully, to give him your attention, whether you wanted to or not. He had heard about the latest attack, he said. Terrible thing. His offer still stood. $200 or 5 acres. The McBride place had sold to him after losing 15 head. The Wilsons had lost 20. Wolves did not stop on their own. Marshall said no. Voss nodded as if he had expected this, as if he were a reasonable bog dealing with unreasonable people, and was simply being patient until they came to their senses. Then Hadley stepped onto the porch. Where is your dog, Mr. Voss? Voss's smile held, but something behind it shifted the way a wall holds steady while the foundation beneath it cracks. Ember is home, under the weather. Hadley tilted her head to the right. Under the weather, she repeated, or under a bandage on her left shoulder. The porch was very quiet. Marshall did not move, but his hand, the one nearest the rifle, opened and closed once. Voss looked at Hadley, not the polite, dismissive glance he had given her on his first visit. This time he truly looked, and in his silver-gray eyes, Hadley could see the rapid, precise calculation of a man who has just identified the most dangerous piece on the board and is adjusting his strategy accordingly. He did not answer her question. He put his hat back on, mounted his horse, and looked down at Marshall from the saddle. His voice when he spoke was no longer soft. It was not loud either. It was simply honest, which was somehow worse. Think carefully, Ledyard. Winter comes fast up here, and wolves get hungrier when it's cold. He turned the horse. But before he rode away, his eyes swept the porch one more time, and they stopped, as they always stopped, on Tiernan. The pause was brief, deliberate, a man checking on an investment. Then he was gone. That night, Marshall found Hadley on the porch. He did not sit beside her. He stood at the rail, his back to her, looking at the mountains. His left hand worked the callus on his palm. I think you should go down to town for a while, he said. Stay at the boarding house until this business with Voss is settled. It's going to get dangerous up here, and I don't want... He stopped, reconsidered, started again. You should be somewhere safe. Hadley sat very still. The words hit her in a place that was older than this mountain, older than Montana, older than the 11-day train ride and the 3-day wagon journey. They hit her in the place where Mrs. Fenn's son had stood in the doorway of the sewing shop and told her to pack her things and be gone by evening. In the place where every temporary home she had ever known had eventually produced someone who stood in a doorway and said politely or otherwise that it was time to leave. Marshall was not being cruel. She knew that. He was being protective in the only way he understood, which was to remove the thing he cared about from the path of the thing he feared. It was the same instinct that made him eat last and sleep lightest and stand between his brothers in every threat. He was trying to save her, but to Hadley it sounded like every other goodbye. Another closed door, another packed suitcase, another road leading away from another place that had almost for a few weeks felt like it might be home. She went to her room. She opened her suitcase. She began to fold her one extra dress. Bishop was lying in the doorway. When Hadley moved toward the door with the suitcase in her hand, the dog stood up. He did not move aside. He planted his big body across the threshold and looked up at her with brown eyes that held a conviction so absolute it was almost human. His tail was down. His ears were flat. He whined once, a small sound from a large animal, and he did not move. Hadley stood in the doorway with her suitcase and looked at the dog who had chosen her on the first night, who had slept at her door every night since who had known before anyone else in this family that she belonged here. She set the suitcase down. From the main room, she heard footsteps. Sully appeared in the hallway. He looked at the suitcase. He looked at Hadley. His knife was in his hand, but he was not throwing it. He was holding it still, which was something Sully almost never did. Don't, His voice was quiet, stripped of its usual sharp humor. Marshall isn't throwing you out. Marshall is scared for you. But that fool is dumber than his own stew. He doesn't know how to keep someone close without pushing them away first. He turned and walked toward the porch. Through the open door, Hadley heard his voice harder, now aimed at Marshall. If you send her away, you'll be real good at keeping your promise to Ma. 4 brothers together in a cabin that's falling apart. Congratulations. Silence from the porch. Hadley left the suitcase where it was. She stepped over Bishop, who wagged his tail once in quiet triumph, and walked outside. Marshall stood at the rail. He did not turn when she approached. I am not here because I have nowhere else to go, Hadley said. Each word was measured precise the way her stitches were precise. I am here because I choose to be here, and I am not leaving because you are afraid. Marshall's hand stopped working the callus. He turned, looked at her. In the lamplight from the cabin window, his face was a landscape of competing forces, the instinct to protect, the fear of loss, and something newer, something that had been growing in the space between them for weeks and that he did not yet have a name for. He nodded. Once, it was not a word, but it was a surrender, not to her. To the idea that she had the right to choose her own danger and that his job was not to choose for her but to stand beside her when the danger came. The letter arrived by courier 3 days later. A boy from the trading post at the base of the mountain rode up with a single envelope addressed to Tiernan Ledyard. Not Marshall. Not the Ledyard brothers. Tiernan specifically. Tiernan took the letter, thanked the boy, and waited until he was alone in the barn to open it. Hadley was not watching from the cabin window. She was feeding Bishop on the porch and happened to look toward the barn at the moment Tiernan read the letter. She saw his face change, not gradually, instantly, as if every drop of blood had been pulled from his skin by some internal gravity. His hands, those large hands that could fix anything, began to tremble. The letter shook in his grip like a leaf in a wind that no one else could feel. He crumpled the paper, walked to the fireplace, threw it in, watched it burn. Then he picked up his axe and went outside, and the sound of chopping that filled the next hour was different from any chopping Hadley had heard before. It was faster, harder, each impact carrying a force that had nothing to do with wood and everything to do with something inside Tiernan that was breaking and that he was trying to hold together through the sheer physical act of splitting things apart. In the cabin, Doyle sat by the window and watched his brother through the glass. Then he opened his journal and wrote in his careful hand, October 15, letter unknown sender, Tiernan afraid. Over the following days, the change in Tiernan was visible to everyone but understood by no one. He worked more, he slept less. The axe sounded before dawn at 3 in the morning, and its rhythm was no longer the steady, meditative pulse that the ranch had come to treat as its heartbeat. It was frantic, percussive, the sound of a man trying to chop his way out of his own skin. Marshall told him to sleep. He did not respond. Hadley asked him one evening what the letter had said. Tiernan looked at her with eyes that had gone flat closed, emptied of the quiet warmth she had come to expect from him. It's none of your concern, he said. His voice was not angry. It was worse than angry. It was the voice of a man building a wall in real time, mortaring shut the one opening through which anyone might reach him. Hadley did not push. She recognized the architecture of that wall. She had built versions of it herself. You did not tear down walls like that with force. You waited. You sat on the porch step at dusk and did not speak and let the person inside the wall know that you would still be there when they were ready to open the door. But the axe did not stop, and the door did not open. It was Sully who finally put words to the thing everyone had been circling. He found Hadley on the porch one evening, the same porch where all the important conversations in this family seemed to happen, as if the cabin itself were too small to contain certain truths, and they had to be spoken under open sky. Sully was throwing his knife. The rhythm was fast tonight, the blade going high, catching lamplight at the top of its arc, before falling back to his hand with a soft slap. Fast meant troubled. Hadley had learned this weeks ago. I asked Ma something once, he said. He did not look at Hadley. He looked at the knife the way it rose and fell, rose and fell. I was 11. I said, why does Tiernan always act like he's about to be thrown out? She didn't answer. She just got this look on her face like I'd touched something that hurt. And she said, promise me you will never ask that again. So I promised. The knife went up, came down. But Ma's gone now, and the question is still here. Hadley waited. I don't think anything, Sully said, and his voice had lost its sharp edge, its constant armor of irony, and what was underneath was younger and rawer than anything she had heard from him before. I know he's not like us, not because of his hair, not because of his eyes, because of how he loves us. He caught the knife and held it still. Blood brothers love like it's guaranteed, like a fact, like gravity. You don't think about gravity. You just know the ground will be there. Marshall and Doyle and me, we fight and we yell and we throw boots at each other's heads because we know that none of it matters, that we will always be brothers, that nothing we do can change it. He paused. Tiernan has never loved us like that. Tiernan loves us like every day might be the last day, like he has to earn it fresh every morning, like the ground might disappear. The knife started moving again. Slower now. The rhythm of a man who has finally said the thing he has been carrying for 12 years and feels it lifting from him, not gone but lighter. Blood brothers take things for granted, Sully said quietly. Tiernan has never taken a single thing for granted in his life. Cormac Voss came for the last time on a morning when the aspens had turned gold and the air tasted like iron and the first skin of ice had formed on the water bucket overnight. He did not ride alone. He brought with him a folder of papers and an expression that had finally stopped pretending to be friendly. The mask was off. What was underneath was patient and cold and absolutely certain of its own position. He stood in the yard and waited for Marshall to come out, and when Marshall appeared on the porch with all three brothers behind him, Voss did not remove his hat. I have a final offer, he said. His voice was still soft. Softness was his nature, not his performance. Even at the end, he spoke gently the way a man speaks to livestock he was about to slaughter. You sell me this ranch. Fair price. Full market value. I have the papers here. Or I send this letter to the county sheriff and to every rancher within 50 miles of this mountain. He held up a single sheet of paper. Boone Asher, he read, who killed Garrett Ledyard in the land dispute of 1860, has a son. That son currently lives at the Ledyard Ranch under the name Tiernan Ledyard. The words fell into the mountain air and hung there. Marshall did not move. Doyle did not move. Sully's knife stopped mid-throw, caught at the apex, suspended between up and down like a held breath. Tiernan stood at the edge of the porch. His face was gray. His hands hung at his sides. He was not running. He was not hiding. He was standing in the open, waiting for the blow, the way he had been waiting for it for weeks, perhaps years, perhaps his entire life. Voss looked at Marshall with the calm eyes of a man presenting a mathematical proof. You are sheltering the son of the man who murdered your father. I don't know if that is technically a crime, but the sheriff will be interested. Your neighbors will be fascinated. And when the story spreads, and it will spread, every rancher in this territory will know that the Ledyard family raised a killer's boy under their own roof. He let the silence do its work. Your land or your secret neighbor. Choose. Marshall read the paper, read it again. Then he looked up, and his eyes found Tiernan, and for a long, terrible moment, nothing moved. Two men looked at each other across 10 feet of porch boards, and in the space between them was every meal they had shared, every fence they had built, every silent morning when Tiernan's axe had woken Marshall before dawn, and Marshall had lain in his bed and listened and never once asked him to stop. Tiernan spoke. His voice was low and steady and carried the weight of something he had been holding alone for weeks. It's true, he said. My father was Boone Asher. Ma Colleen took me in when I was 13. I did not know my father killed anyone until the first letter came. The silence that followed was not like other silences. It was not the comfortable silence of the porch at evening or the working silence of men who know each other too well to need words. It was the silence of a foundation cracking, the silence of the moment before a building decides whether to stand or fall. Marshall turned back to Voss. He looked at the paper in the man's hand. He looked at the pale gray eyes and the careful smile and the long leather coat that was too clean for a man who lived honestly. Get off my land, Marshall said. His voice was not loud. It was quiet in a way that was more frightening than shouting. The way deep water is more frightening than rapids because you cannot see what is moving beneath the surface. Voss tilted his head. You don't understand what I understand. You used wolves to bleed my cattle. You use paper to threaten my brother. Now get off Ledyard land before I show you why every ranch on this mountain knows our name." His hand was on the rifle, not gripping it, resting on it, the way a man's hand rests on a thing it knows well and can use without thinking. Sully had caught his knife. He was holding it now, not throwing it, and his knuckles were white. Doyle had materialized an axe from somewhere, holding it across his body with both hands. Tiernan stood motionless, fists clenched the tendons in his forearms, standing out like cables. Voss looked at the four of them. He was a calculating man, and he calculated now, and the math told him that this particular moment was not survivable. He stepped back, mounted his horse. But at the top of the saddle he paused and looked down at them with the patience of a man who has lost a battle but not a war. "This isn't finished," he said. "The wolves are still out there, and so is the truth." Then he rode down the trail, and the sound of his horse's hooves faded into the distance, and the Ledyard ranch was quiet again. But it was a different quiet than before. It was the quiet of something that had broken and had not yet been repaired. They stood in the cabin, all five of them. The fire was low and the shadows were long, and no one had lit the lamps. Tiernan stood near the door as if uncertain whether he still had permission to be further inside. His face held the expression of a man who has removed his own armor in the presence of people who might kill him and is simply waiting to see what they do. Sully erupted first because Sully always erupted first. The words came out in a torrent of outrage and hurt and the specific fury of a younger brother who has just discovered that the world is more complicated than he thought and is furious about it. "Scared you were scared that we would throw you out. 15 years, Tiernan. 15 years you ate at this table, slept under this roof, woke up at 3 in the morning to chop wood for people who never once asked you to, and you thought we would throw you out." Tiernan's voice when it came was barely a voice at all. It was a sound made by a man who has been holding a door shut against a storm for years and has finally let go of the handle. "My father killed your father." The sentence sat in the room like a live coal on a wooden floor. Doyle spoke then, and his voice was the calmest thing in the cabin, steady and measured, and precise as if accuracy itself were a form of compassion. "Boone Asher killed our father," he said. "Not you. You were 13 years old, abandoned, wandering. Ma took you in because she knew the difference between a man and his father's sins." Sully nodded fiercely, and she was right. Then Sully said the thing he would regret for the rest of his life. It came out of the storm of his emotions, out of the chaos of a young man who was feeling too many things at once and whose mouth moved faster than his judgment. He was not trying to be cruel. He was trying to understand, and in his desperation to make sense of something that had no sense, he reached for the nearest weapon, which was always words, and he swung it without looking. "Maybe that's why you never argue," Sully said, "because you knew you didn't have the right to argue here." The words hit Tiernan like a physical blow. Hadley saw it. She saw his body absorb the impact, saw his shoulders fold inward, saw something in his dark eyes extinguish like a candle in a sudden wind. Because Sully had just confirmed the thing Tiernan had feared most. Not that he would be cast out. Something worse. That he had been tolerated. That his place in this family was not a right, but a gift, and gifts could be revoked, and he had known it all along, and now someone had finally said it out loud. Sully knew it too. The moment the words were out of his mouth, the color drained from his face. His knife, which he had been holding the entire time, slipped from his fingers and hit the cabin floor with a sound that was small and final. It was the first time in Hadley's memory that Sullivan Ledyard had dropped his knife. Tiernan looked at Sully, said nothing, turned, walked out of the cabin. The door closed behind him. From outside, after a moment of terrible silence, came the sound of the axe. Doyle sat down heavily, opened his journal, closed it, opened it again. His hands were shaking too much to write. Marshall had not spoken a single word since ordering Voss off the land. He stood in the center of the cabin with his arms at his sides and his face completely still, and Hadley could see behind his stillness the enormous grinding machinery of a man processing something that challenged the deepest structure of his understanding. Then Marshall walked to the door, opened it, stepped outside, closed it behind him. Gently, not a slam, gentle, which was somehow so much worse. From outside, two sounds: the distant, frantic rhythm of Tiernan's axe and the absence of Marshall's voice. The axe spoke of destruction. The silence spoke of a man who was not ready to choose. Sully stared at the knife on the floor. He did not pick it up. He sat down on the bench and put his head in his hands, and for the first time since Hadley had known him, Sullivan Ledyard had nothing to say. Hadley stood in the middle of the cabin, surrounded by silence and the fading warmth of the fire. Bishop lay on the floor between the door to her room and the door to the porch, his head on his paws, his brown eyes moving between the two exits. The dog did not know which direction to run. Neither did she. Outside, the axe continued, blow after blow after blow, the heartbeat of a ranch that was breaking apart. Tiernan Ledyard chopped wood at 3 in the morning because it was the only language he had ever trusted. Words could be misunderstood. Silence could be misread. But labor was honest. Labor was proof. Every cord of firewood stacked beside the cabin wall was a sentence in a conversation Tiernan had been having with this family for 15 years, and every sentence said the same thing: I am useful. I am necessary. Please do not send me away. He had been chopping since midnight. The moon was high and cold and threw blue shadows across the woodpile and the yard and the dark tree line beyond. His shirt was soaked through despite the freezing air. His hands had bled and dried and bled again, and he had not noticed because pain was not relevant to the task. The task was the only thing. The task was the wall between himself and the thing waiting for him on the other side of stillness. If he stopped chopping, he would have to think. And if he thought, he would have to feel. And if he felt, the feeling would be this: that he had always known in some wordless chamber of his body that he did not belong here. That the 15 years of firewood and fence repairs and silent, desperate service had been a loan against a debt he could never repay, because the debt was not his labor, but his blood. And his blood was the blood of the man who had murdered the father of the 3 men he loved more than anything in the world. The axe fell, rose, fell, rose. Each impact sent a shock through his arms and into his shoulders and down his spine. And each shock was a small mercy because it replaced the other thing, the thing with teeth, the thing that was eating him from the inside. He did not hear Marshall approach. Marshall moved quietly for a large man. He always had. He came around the corner of the cabin and stood 10 feet from the woodpile and watched his brother destroy a log that had already been split 3 times and no longer needed splitting. He watched for a full minute. Then he spoke. Stop. Tiernan did not stop. The axe rose, fell, bit into wood that was already kindling. Tiernan, stop. The axe rose again. Marshall stepped forward and caught the handle at the top of its arc, his hand closing around the hickory just below the steel head. The axe stopped in midair, held between 2 forces, and the 2 men stood facing each other in the blue light of a Montana moon with nothing between them except 3 feet of frozen air and the truth. Marshall did not let go of the axe. Tiernan did not let go either. They stood like that, connected by the tool, and Marshall spoke. I have known since I was 12 years old. The words came out flat and simple, the way Marshall said everything, without decoration, without preparation, as if he were reporting the weather or the cattle count. But they landed on Tiernan like a physical weight. Hadley, watching from the cabin window, where she had been standing since the axe woke her, saw Tiernan's body go rigid. Not the rigidity of surprise. The rigidity of a man who has just been told that the floor he has been standing on for 16 years is not the floor he thought it was. Ma kept a letter, Marshall said, in the wooden chest under her bed, the one with the brass latch that stuck. I have found it when I was 12 looking for Pa's old hunting knife. I wasn't supposed to open it. I opened it. He paused, not for drama. Marshall did not do drama. He paused because the next words were heavy, and he needed to set his feet before lifting them. The letter said, Tiernan is the son of Boone Asher. If you are reading this, I am gone. Love him the way I loved him. The axe trembled between them. I was 12, you were 13. You've been living with us for a year. You were already getting up before dawn to chop wood. You were already fixing things that nobody asked you to fix. You were already eating fast, like every meal might be the last one, like someone might take the plate away. Marshall's voice did not waver, but it deepened the way a river deepens when it passes over bedrock, slowing and gaining weight. I read the letter, then I burned it. I went outside and I sat on the fence rail and I looked at the mountains and I made a decision. He released the axe handle. Tiernan held it. The blade hung at his side, forgotten. The decision was that it did not matter. It did not matter who your father was. It did not matter what he did, because you were not him. You were the boy who got up at dawn and split wood for a family that was not his own because he did not know any other way to say thank you. Marshall stepped closer. One step. The distance between them was now the distance between two people who are about to either embrace or fight, and in this family those two things had always been closer together than most people understood. You are my brother, Marshall said. Not because of blood. Blood is an accident. You are my brother because of 15 years of 3 o'clock firewood. Because of every fence post you dug, and every roof leak you patched, and every morning you showed up and did the work without being asked and without being thanked. That is not blood. That is choice, and it is worth more. Tiernan's knees buckled. He did not fall. He sank. The axe slipped from his fingers and thudded into the earth beside him, and he went down to his knees in the frost-covered grass, and he did not cry. He did something that Hadley, watching from the window with tears running silently down her own face, thought was more devastating than crying. He breathed. He took a breath that seemed to start at the bottom of his body and work its way up through every constricted, armored, defended layer of himself, and when it reached his mouth, it came out in a sound that was not a sob and not a gasp, but something older than both. It was the sound of a man who had been holding his breath for 15 years, finally letting it go. Marshall put his hand on Tiernan's shoulder. The hand was large and rough and scarred from 35 years of rope and leather and work that never ended. He pressed down with the kind of weight that was not oppressive but structural, the weight of a load-bearing wall, the weight that keeps the roof from falling in. They stayed like that for a long time. Two men in the cold moonlight, one kneeling and one standing, connected by a hand on a shoulder, and by 16 years of a choice that had been made once and then made again every single day in silence. Then Marshall said in a voice that had shifted from bedrock to something slightly lighter, slightly rougher, the voice he used when he was substituting complaint for tenderness, because tenderness was a language he had never been taught. Now stop chopping wood at 3 in the morning. I have not slept through a single night in 15 years because of your axe. Tiernan looked up. And on his face, for the first time since Hadley had arrived at this ranch, there was something that was not fear, not vigilance, not the desperate alertness of a guest who knows he has overstayed. There was rest, just for a moment, the faintest beginning of what it might feel like to stop running. The attack came the following night. Voss had timed it with the precision of a man who understood that desperation had a calendar. The cattle drive to Miles City had to begin within 3 days or the passes would close. 25 animals, the bare minimum, needed to walk 60 miles through mountain terrain. One more loss and the Leadyard Ranch was finished not because Voss would buy it, but because winter would do what wool wolves could not. Doyle had predicted that. His journal, now thick with weeks of observations, contained a page he had written that afternoon. October 29th, full moon, last night before we must decide on the drive. If Voss moves, he moves tonight. He cannot afford to wait. When Marshall asked Doyle how he knew, Doyle showed him the journal. The pattern of attacks, the intervals between them, the way each attack came at a moment of maximum vulnerability, as if someone were watching the ranch and calculating the precise instant when pressure would be most effective. I always count, Doyle said, and the count says tonight. For the first time in his life, Marshall looked at his brother's journal and saw it not as a curiosity, but as a weapon. He nodded. They prepared. The plan was Doyle's. This too was a first. Marshall had always been the strategist, the one who decided where to stand and when to shoot and who would do what. But tonight Marshall looked at his brother, the one they called the dreamer, the one they teased about his ink-stained fingers and his flower observations, and he said, "Tell us what to do." Doyle told them. Marshall and Tiernan would hold the main corral fence. They were the two strongest, and the fence was the critical point. If it held, the cattle stayed contained. If it broke, the animals would scatter into the darkness, and the wolves would pick them apart. Sully would circle around to the east, the direction from which the previous attacks had come. He was the fastest and the quietest and could read terrain in the dark the way other people read books. Doyle himself would build and maintain a ring of fire around the corral perimeter. Fire was the one thing wolves feared absolutely. Even directed wolves, even Ember. If he could keep the ring burning, the wolves would have no approach lane. and Hadley would take position on the cabin roof, the highest point on the ranch. From there, with Marshall's rifle and the clear sightlines of a full moon night, she could see the entire property. She was the overwatch. The last line. Marshall hesitated at this, not because he doubted her aim. He had seen her shoot. He hesitated because putting her on the roof meant putting her in the most exposed position on the ranch, visible from every direction with no cover and no retreat. Hadley saw the hesitation. She said nothing. She simply picked up the rifle, checked the action, and walked toward the ladder that leaned against the cabin's south wall. Marshall watched her climb. When she reached the roof and settled into position, lying flat against the shingles with the rifle braced on the ridge beam, he looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned to his brothers and said, "We hold until dawn." The wolves came at midnight. They came from the tree line in a silent, spreading wave, not running, but trotting, moving with the controlled discipline of animals that had been guided to this point many times before. Doyle counted 8, the largest pack yet. They fanned out along the east and south perimeters of the corral, testing, probing, looking for the weak point. Doyle lit the first fire. Bundles of straw soaked in lamp oil placed at intervals around the corral caught and flared and threw a ring of orange light across the yard. The wolves checked, pulling back from the flames. For a moment it seemed like the fire alone would be enough. Then the wolves split. 4 went east toward the fence section Sully was guarding. 4 went south toward the gap between 2 fire points where the light was weakest. They were being directed, not by instinct, by intelligence. Marshall fired. The shot cracked the night open and sent a wolf tumbling, yelping into the darkness. Not dead, wounded. It scrambled up and ran. Tiernan stood in the south gap with a fence rail in his hand, swinging it like a weapon, and the sound of wood striking muscle was heavy and final. 2 wolves retreated from his position. On the east side, Sully's shotgun boomed twice. Wolves scattered, regrouped, came again. Doyle was burning through his fuel. Straw, wood scraps, dried grass. The fires needed constant feeding, and the supply was running low. He reached for the next bundle and found it was the last. Beyond it, there was nothing left to burn. He stood in the firelight with empty hands and looked at the darkness pressing in. The wolves were regrouping. The fire was dying. In 30 seconds, the ring would have a gap, and the wolves would pour through it like water through a broken dam. Doyle reached into his coat and pulled out a book. It was Great Expectations, the copy he had carried from Ohio 15 years ago. The copy he had read so many times the spine had cracked and the pages had softened to the texture of cloth. It was his most precious possession, his connection to the world beyond this mountain. The proof that inside the body of a rancher lived the mind of something else, something that needed stories the way other men needed air. He looked at it for 1 second. The firelight played across the worn cover. Then he tore out a fistful of pages and fed them to the flames. The fire surged, the gap closed. Doyle tore out more pages and more, and the wolves pulled back from the renewed blaze and the perimeter held. He burned the book chapter by chapter, Pip's journey consumed by the same fire that was saving his family, and he did not hesitate, and he did not stop until the last page was ash, and the last wolf had retreated to a safe distance. On the cabin roof, Hadley lay flat against the shingles and controlled her breathing. The rifle was warm against her cheek. She watched the battle below with the focused calm her father had taught her, the calm that came not from fearlessness, but from training so deep it had become reflex. She had fired 4 times. Each shot had been precise, placed not to kill, but to redirect driving wolves away from the weakest points in the defense. Her father's voice in her memory, a good hunter shoots to protect, not to destroy. The battle was turning. The wolves were retreating. The ring of fire held. The cattle panicked, but contained, pressed together in the center of the corral. Then Hadley saw movement at the edge of the tree line that was not a wolf, a horse, moving fast along the north tree line, staying in the shadows. A rider tall and thin, wearing a long coat that she recognized even in the darkness. Voss, he came from the blind side, the north, the direction no one was watching, because the wolves had attacked from the east and south. He came fast and quiet and aimed directly at the one person who was standing alone, exposed, separated from the others by 40 yards of open ground. Tiernan. Tiernan was at the south gap, his back to the north, focused entirely on the wolves in front of him. He did not see Voss. He did not hear the horse above the sound of fire, and cattle and gunshots. He did not know what was happening until Voss's arm hooked around his chest and lifted him off his feet and onto the back of the horse in one violent motion. A pistol pressed against Tiernan's temple. Sully saw it first. His voice cut through the chaos with the sharp carrying quality that made it audible above any amount of noise. Voss has Tiernan. The fighting stopped. The wolves, as if receiving a signal, pulled back to the tree line and waited. The fires crackled and popped. In the sudden relative quiet, Voss sat on his horse in the center of the yard with Tiernan pinned against him and a gun against Tiernan's head. Your land or your brother Ledyard? Voss's voice was calm, almost gentle, the voice of a man closing a transaction. Choose. Tiernan struggled against the arm holding him. His voice came out raw and desperate. Don't trade anything for me. Marshall stood at the corral fence. His rifle was in his hands, but the angle was wrong. Voss was behind Tiernan, using him as a shield, and any shot from ground level risked hitting the man Marshall had just claimed for the first time in his life as his brother. Marshall raised one hand, the signal for everyone to stop. The yard went silent. Fire, wind, the distant sound of wolves waiting in the trees. Marshall looked at Voss, looked at Tiernan, looked at the gun against Tiernan's head, and in his eyes Hadley could see even from the rooftop 40 yards away the thing he was calculating. Not whether to surrender the land, not whether to rush Voss. He was calculating trust. He was measuring in the space of a single heartbeat whether he believed in something enough to stake his brother's life on it. He spoke. One word. Quiet. Clear. Made not at Voss, but at the roof. Hadley. On the cabin roof, Hadley had been tracking Voss through her sights since the moment she saw the horse emerge from the tree line. She had the angle that Marshall did not. From above, she could see the space between Voss and Tiernan, the 6 inches of separation between Voss's gun hand and Tiernan's head. It was not a generous margin, but it was a margin. Her father had taught her to shoot in conditions worse than this, in rain that blurred the sights, in darkness that swallowed the target, in wind that pushed the bullet sideways. The rifle against her cheek was not the one he had given her, the short-stock Springfield hidden under her mattress. But the steadiness in her hands was his. The patience was his. The voice in her memory was his. A clean shot is not about perfection. It is about patience. Wait for the moment. It will come. She waited. Voss turned his head to look at Marshall. Just slightly. Just enough. His gun hand, for one fraction of 1 second, moved half an inch away from Tiernan's temple as his body shifted with the turn. Hadley breathed out. Squeezed. The rifle cracked. The bullet hit Voss's gun hand, not his wrist, not his forearm, his hand, the meaty part between thumb and forefinger, the part that controls grip. The pistol spun away into the darkness. Voss screamed. It was a raw animal sound, the first honest sound he had made since Hadley had known him. The sound of a man whose careful plans had just been dismantled by a seamstress from Vermont who could shoot straighter in the dark than he could think in the daylight. Tiernan threw himself sideways off the horse, hit the ground, rolled. Sully was already running. Marshall was already running. Bishop was barking with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than instinct, the sound of an animal that had known the truth from the very first day and had been waiting with the patience of his kind for the humans to catch up. And then from the tree line, Ember appeared. The silver wolf stepped out of the shadows and into the firelight. She was thinner than when Hadley had last seen her. The wound on her left shoulder had healed into a puckered scar. The leather collar around her neck caught the light. She stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the scene with yellow eyes that held something Hadley could not name but could recognize because she had seen it in Tiernan's eyes every day for weeks. The wild wolves waited behind Ember, watching her the way a pack watches its leader, waiting for direction, waiting to be told what to do. Voss, on the ground now, bleeding from his hands, screaming, saw Ember and screamed something else. A command. The word was lost in his pain, but the tone was clear. Attack. Do what you were trained to do. Be what I made you. Ember looked at Voss. The yellow eyes were steady, unwavering. She looked at him the way an animal looks at a thing it has outgrown. Then she turned, slowly, without hurry, without fear. She turned her back on the man who had raised her from a pup, who had put the collar on her neck, who had trained her to lead wild wolves to slaughter for his profit. She turned away from him and walked toward the tree line, and the wild pack turned with her, following their leader as they always had, and the wolves moved into the forest and vanished. No attack, no obedience, just a choice. Hadley lowered the rifle and watched the silver shape disappear into the darkness. A wolf raised by the wrong hands wearing a collar, she did not choose loyal to a master who used her as a weapon. And in the end, she walked away. She chose the forest over the command. She chose herself. Hadley thought of Tiernan and of collars that were invisible, and of the moment when a creature that has been told its whole life what it is decides finally what it wants to be. Sully and Marshall pinned Voss to the ground. The man was still screaming, clutching his bleeding hand. Tiernan stood over him, breathing hard, his dark eyes looking down at the man who had tried to use his past to destroy his family. He could have hit Voss. He could have done any number of things that rage and relief might justify. He did not. He stepped back, turned to Marshall, and for the first time the two brothers looked at each other without the invisible wall between them, without the secret, without the weight. Marshall put his hand on Tiernan's shoulder. The same hand, the same shoulder, the same weight. In the morning, Marshall and Sully took Voss down the mountain to the sheriff. Doyle stayed behind. He sat at the kitchen table with his journal open and a pen in his hand, and the focused, methodical intensity of a man who has spent his entire life being told that his mind was less valuable than his muscles, and has finally been given the chance to prove otherwise. He compiled everything, every observation, every date, every track count, every sketch paw print, every notation of hoof prints beside wolf tracks. He mapped the pattern of attacks, showing how they escalated in size and timing to match the ranch's most vulnerable moments. He documented the chain link Hadley had found, describing its material composition and its match to Ember's collar. He included the testimony of his own eyes, the silver wolf that Voss called a dog, the same silver wolf that led the pack, the same silver wolf that Voss had carried away wounded on his horse in the dark. He wrote it all in his precise, careful hand, and when he was finished, he had produced something that was not a journal entry, but a legal document. A case. Evidence assembled with the rigor of a mind that had been cataloging the world since childhood and had finally found a reason that mattered. When the sheriff read it, he sent deputies to the McBride Ranch and the Wilson Ranch, both of which Voss had acquired through the same scheme wolves sent to destroy livestock, then the offer to solve the problem for a price the ranchers could not pay, then the acquisition of land at a fraction of its value. 3 families ruined by a man who created the disease and sold the cure. The charges were fraud and willful destruction of property. Voss would stand trial in Miles City. The McBride and Wilson families, reading Doyle's documentation, realized for the first time that their losses had not been misfortune, but engineering. When Marshall returned from town, he found Doyle on the porch with his journal on his knee and his fingers tapping the spine in the slow, steady rhythm of a man at peace. Marshall stood beside him. He was not a man who gave compliments. Compliments required a vulnerability that 15 years of responsibility had trained out of him. But he looked at his brossard and he said the thing that Doyle had waited his entire life to hear. "You in that notebook. Thank God for it." Doyle's finger stopped tapping. He looked up at Marshall, and in his green eyes there was something luminous, something that looked like the sunrise must look to a man who has been told his whole life that his work does not matter and has just been told by the one person whose opinion he values above all others that it does. He nodded, tapped the spine once more. Slow, content. Then he said quietly, "I need a new book. I burned the other one." Marshall looked at him. "I know," he said, and said nothing else. But Hadley saw him go to the supply list he kept on the kitchen wall, the list of things to buy in Miles City, and add one item at the bottom in his heavy, angular handwriting book. The cattle drive began 2 days later. 25 animals, the exact minimum, walking 60 miles through mountain passes that were already showing the first signs of winter. Tiernan and Marshall led the herd. Sully and Doyle rode the flanks. Hadley stayed at the ranch with Bishop, and for 3 days the cabin was quiet in a way it had never been before, the quiet of a place that has been emptied of the people who give it meaning. They returned on the 4th day. Marshall came through the door, first dropped a pouch of coins on the table, and said, "Enough." One word. It covered the debt, the provisions, and the promise of survival. The ranch would live through winter. That night, Hadley sat by the fire and mended Tiernan's shirt. It was the shirt he had been wearing when Voss pulled him onto the horse. The fabric was torn along the left side, a long rip from shoulder to waist, where the cloth had caught on the saddle horn. It was the worst damage she had repaired since arriving, and she worked on it for an hour, her needle moving in the same small, precise stitches she had used on Marshall's shirt weeks before. The same thread, the same technique, the same invisible mend. When she finished, the repair was nearly undetectable. A line of stitches so fine they disappeared into the weave of the fabric, a mend that said in the only language Hadley fully trusted, "You are worth the same care. You are treated the same. You are equal." Tiernan put the shirt on the next morning. He stood in the kitchen and his hand went to the mended seam, the way Marshall's hand had gone to his own mended shoulder weeks ago. The same gesture, the same unconscious recognition that someone had repaired something that was broken without being asked and without expecting thanks. He looked at Hadley, did not speak. But for the first time since she had known him, his eyes were calm, not watchful, not frightened, not scanning the room for signs that he was about to be asked to leave, just calm. The eyes of a man who has finally accepted that the floor beneath him is solid and will hold. Hadley began the needlework on a Thursday evening. She sat at the kitchen table with a piece of flour sack canvas stretched over her knee and a needle threaded with red cotton. The brothers were scattered through the cabin in their evening positions. Marshall at the table cleaning a bridle, Doyle writing in a new journal, a blank one that had been among the provisions from Miles City placed in his hands by Marshall, without comment or ceremony. Tiernan was repairing a leather hinge on the barn door, and Sully sat on the porch tossing his knife, the rhythm slow and easy tonight, the rhythm of a man who was at rest but not yet at peace. Sully came inside, saw Hadley working, leaned against the doorframe. "What are you making?" Hadley held up the canvas. On it in red thread she had embroidered 5 names. They were arranged in a simple column, each name in the same steady even script, each letter, the same size, each line of stitching identical to the others. Marshall, Doyle, Tiernan, Sullivan, Hadley. "For the kitchen wall, Mom," she said, "so everyone remembers who lives here." Sully looked at the canvas. His eyes moved down the column of names. She watched him read each one, watched his lips move slightly as he parsed the letters, and she watched him arrive at the 5th one and stop. His knife was in his hand. It was not moving. "You put your name in there," he said. "A yidbeej of here." Sully looked at the canvas for a long time, at the 5 names rendered in identical thread by identical hands, each one given the same weight, the same care, the same precise and painstaking attention to detail. There was no hierarchy in the stitching. No name was larger or more prominent. They were equal. They were family. His knife started again, but slowly, gently, the rhythm of something settling into place. The conversation happened on the porch, as all important conversations did on an evening when the first real cold had arrived, and the stars were sharp and close, and the mountains stood against the sky like the edge of the known world. 4 brothers, 1 woman, 1 dog. Bishop lay at Tiernan's feet with his chin on his paws and his tail making slow sweeps across the porch boards. Sully spoke first. He always spoke first. But tonight his voice carried a weight that Hadley had not heard from him, before a gravity that sat uneasily on a young man's shoulders, but sat there nonetheless because some things could only be said by the person willing to say them, and Sully had always been that person for better and for worse. Tiernan looked at him. "Before I say anything else, I need to say this." Sully was not throwing his knife. It was in his hand, but his hand was still, and the stillness was its own kind of statement. "What I said that night, that you didn't have the right to argue here, that was the worst thing I have ever said in my life. And I have said a considerable number of bad things." He paused, breathed. "I am not asking you to forgive me. I am telling you that I was wrong. And I will carry the weight of having said it for the rest of my life, because that is what I deserve for using words to hurt the one person in this family who never uses words at all." Tiernan looked at Sully for a long moment. The porch was quiet. Then Tiernan nodded, once. A single dip of his chin that granted something that was not quite forgiveness and not quite absolution, but something more practical: permission to continue. Permission to move forward. Permission to put the broken thing on and build something new. Sully took the permission and ran with it. "You are not like us," he said. You don't fight at breakfast. You don't throw boots at my head. You don't steal stew from Marshall's plate and blame Doyle. From across the porch, Doyle's voice rose in genuine indignation. When did that happen? Which time? Sully ignored him with practiced ease. You don't do any of the things that blood brothers do. You never yelled at Marshall for being too controlling, even when he deserved it, and he deserved it plenty. You never called me an idiot, even when I was being one. You never teased Doyle about his books, or his flower notes, or his ink stains. He paused. The knife was still motionless in his hand. But you woke up at 3 in the morning and chopped wood for this family for 15 years. Nobody asked you. Nobody thanked you. You just did it every single day because you thought that was the price of being here. Because you thought love was something you had to purchase with your hands instead of something you were owed by right. Sully's voice broke slightly on the word owed. He recovered. So you are not like us. You are better than us. You have always been better than us. And the fact that it took this long for anyone to say it out loud, it is a failure that belongs to all three of us, not to you. Tiernan looked at the porch floor. His shoulders were shaking, not with sobs, with the effort of containing something that had been building for years and was now finally being allowed to exist. Marshall spoke from his chair. His voice was gruff, the voice of a man who would rather chew gravel than express an emotion directly, but who understood that some moments required it even if the expression came out sideways. Sully is right, and I am ordering you as the head of this family to stop chopping wood at 3 in the morning. 5 o'clock, like a normal human being. Doyle had his new journal open. He was writing. October 31st, he read aloud, his voice carrying the careful formality of a man recording history. Tiernan Ledyard has been officially granted permission to sleep. The sound that came from Tiernan was not a laugh at first. It started somewhere deep in his chest, in the place where the fear had lived, and it rose through him like water through dry ground. And by the time it reached his mouth, it had become something full and uncontrolled, and so fundamentally joyful that it changed the quality of the air on the porch. Tiernan laughed, not a small laugh, not the guarded, careful, almost smile that Hadley had seen him produce on rare occasions. A real laugh, a laugh that shook his shoulders and creased his face and made his dark eyes disappear into lines that she had never seen before because they had never been used. A laugh that sounded like relief and release, and the noise a locked door makes when it finally swings open. Bishop leapt up and licked his face tail, thrashing, and Tiernan grabbed the dog and held him and laughed into his fur, and the sound of it spread across the porch like warmth. Sully's knife started moving again. Slow, rhythmic. The heartbeat of a man who had wounded someone he loved and had done the only thing that could make it right, not ask for forgiveness, but earned it. Dawn came early and cold and golden. Hadley woke before the others, as she always did. She dressed and opened the door of her room and stepped into the kitchen and stopped. Marshall was on the porch. She could see him through the window, standing at the rail looking at the mountains. He was alone. The light was the color of honey, and it caught the steam of his breath and turned it to gold. She went outside, stood beside him. Neither spoke for a moment. The valley below was filled with mist, and the peaks above were sharp and pink, and somewhere in the forest a bird was singing with the particular urgency of a creature that knows winter is coming and wants to be heard before the silence arrives. "You will not be sent away," Marshall said. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the mountains, the way he had always looked at the mountains when he was saying something that mattered, as if the words were easier to release if he aimed them at something vast enough to absorb them. Not from this place. Not ever. Hadley stood beside him. She understood what this was. It was not a declaration of love, because Marshall did not make declarations. It was not a proposal, because proposals implied a question, and this was not a question. It was a promise, made in the language of a man who had spent his entire life holding things together with the force of his will and the strength of his hands, and who had finally, after weeks of watching a woman from Vermont add curtains to his windows and stitches to his shirts and her name to his family, understood that holding on and letting in were not the same thing, and that the second one was harder, and that the second one was the one that mattered. Hadley did not say anything. She did not need to. She stood beside him, shoulder nearly touching shoulder, looking at the same mountains, breathing the same cold air. And that was enough. For both of them, that was enough. Breakfast that morning was the meal Hadley Crane would remember for the rest of her life. She came into the kitchen and found the table set, not beautifully, not with any particular artistry. 4 tin plates arranged at roughly equal intervals with 4 wooden forks that Tiernan had carved placed beside them. A fifth plate at the empty spot between Marshall's place and Tiernan's. A pot of stew on the stove made by Marshall with onions that had been cut for the first time in the history of this kitchen into pieces smaller than a man's fist. No one was fighting. No one was bleeding. The table was upright. The chairs were intact. Bishop was sitting under the table with his chin on his paws, watching the proceedings with the satisfied expression of a creature who has always known how things should be and is pleased that the humans have finally figured it out. Sully looked up from his plate. "Sit down before Bishop eats your share." Hadley sat, the spot between Marshall and Tiernan, the spot that had been empty for 5 years since Colleen Ledyard died, and took with her the only feminine presence this cabin had known. Hadley took the seat and the table was full. She looked around the kitchen. The canvas with 5 names hung on the wall beside the stove. Marshall, Doyle, Tiernan, Sullivan, Hadley. Red thread on white cloth, each name given the same weight, the same hand, the same care. Beside the canvas, the burlap curtains hung in the windows rough and plain and letting in the morning light. On the shelf by the door, Doyle's new journal sat beside the spot where the old one had been. The spine uncracked, the pages white and waiting. Next to it, the pen he used, the one with the perpetual ink stain that transferred itself to his fingers, no matter how carefully he held it. Sully's knife lay on the table beside his plate, motionless resting. And on the stove in the exact center of the cooking surface, Colleen Ledyard's cast iron pot sat where it had always sat, unmoved, untouched, honored. Beside it, smaller, newer, there was a second pot, Hadley's pot, the one she had brought from Vermont in her suitcase, the one she used for heating water and making tea. 2 pots, side by side, the old and the new, not replacing, not competing, existing together. Hadley tilted her head to the right, the habit she had when she was calculating. When she was reading a situation, assessing the truth of it, measuring the distance between what was said and what was meant. But this time she was not calculating anything. She was simply looking at the table with its 5 plates, at the 4 men who had been strangers 2 months ago, and who were now, through the slow accumulation of mended shirts and shared meals and secrets survived, and choices made her family. "What are you looking at?" Sully asked. "Family," Hadley said. Marshall nearly smiled. The crack appeared on his stone face and disappeared, but slower this time, lingering a fraction of a second longer than it ever had before. Doyle opened his journal to the first page and wrote in his precise and careful hand the first entry of the new volume, November 1st. The table has 5 plates. Tiernan ate. Not fast, not with the desperate, anxious efficiency of a man who expected his plate to be taken away. He ate slowly, normally, the way a person eats when they are sitting in their own kitchen at their own table in their own home with people who will still be there when the meal is over. Sully's knife rose from the table and began its slow rotation in the air. Up, turn on down, up, turn it down. The rhythm was steady, even unhurried, the rhythm of a man at peace, and outside the cabin in the sharp morning air, the woodpile stood full and neatly stacked, the axe leaning against it unused because it was 6 o'clock in the morning, and the man who usually wielded it at 3 was inside eating breakfast with his family, and the mountain was quiet and the cattle were safe, and the sound that filled the cabin was not the crack of an axe or the howl of wolves, but something smaller and rarer and infinitely more valuable. The sound of 5 people chewing and talking and arguing about whose turn it was to wash the plates, while a dog with one floppy ear wagged his tail under the table and waited for someone to drop something. Bishop wagged. Someone always dropped something.